You might think that the name of the entire series, Berserk, takes its name from the Berserker armor, but that hellish piece of equipment was introduced 220 chapters into the story, though if we're being honest with ourselves, it has managed to make itself synonymous with the title. The Berserker armor is by far the most fascinating magical fetish in Kentaro Miura's magnum opus, because while it gives its wearer unfathomable strength, it does so in the most torturous way possible. The armor literally sucks the happiness and the life out of its user until nothing but bones remains. A pretty steep price to pay for something as petty as a crown or settling a grudge, but sometimes such things take on a life beyond the ones clinging to them. Throughout the entire series, only 2 characters have ever donned the armor, so in this video, we figured we'd take a look at whose Berserker form is more powerful and why that's the case. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. So without further ado, let's dive straight into it. He used it to conquer the world and did it while riding a horse. Skull Knight's usage and mastery of the Berserker armor. We don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Berserker armor was created for Supreme King Geiserik because for the longest time, he was its only known user. Myths and legends recorded his deeds as being evil beyond compare, and all cultures feared the Skull King because he rode into battle donning a skull-shaped helm. But it became clear in chapter 222 that the reason behind the fear Geiserik inspired wasn't just how he looked in battle, it was also how he engaged in it. If you've seen any of our content on him or the Skull Knight, and we highly recommend that you check that out, you know our thoughts on how the latter came into existence. To make a long story short, 1,000 years ago, the tribe chieftain Geiserik came to the shores of Elfhelm, and there he fell in love with its most powerful sorceress. Using her magic and a new suit of armor he acquired from a dwarf friend of his, Geiserik set out to conquer the world, and he did. He was the first known user of the Berserker armor, and because he won his empire as the Berserker, the stories about his ruthlessness ring truer than we once believed. We've all seen just how brutal Guts can become when he synchronizes with the armor's ode. He doesn't just kill things, he butchers them until there's no chance of them ever moving again. He slices and dices and hacks until he's certain that his target is dead, and then he moves on to the next one. It's pretty easy to imagine Geiserik inspiring intense fear if he rampaged in a similar fashion while he used the armor. Because it's one thing to see the Berserker being used on monsters, but it's an entirely different thing to use it against humans, which Geiserik would have had to do. Seeing a fellow member of your species being mowed down like cardboard can make you give up your freedom in exchange for safety pretty quickly, and we suspect that's how Geiserik pieced his empire together. But there were other factors involved as well. For instance, Geiserik clearly took his lover to the mainland when he started his great invasion, because in a blood memory witnessed by Guts in chapter 362, we see her dying in his arms in what is presumably his capital city. Geiserik would have needed a person with her skill set beside him anyways, because there's only so much the human will can do to resist the Berserker's call. When Hanar created the armor, he chose to make it one of the most monstrous fetishes he could come up with, because great power should always require great sacrifice. The Berserker makes its wearer a nearly indestructible killing machine, capable of soloing armies on their own, but in exchange it takes their flesh and soul. The way that it boosts one's strength is by removing their physical limitations, or rather making them ineffective. It also amplifies negative thoughts and emotions because its sole purpose is to propel its wearer into spilling blood. If the wearer of the armor does not shield their mind from its malignant ode, they're liable to become possessed by it, and forget all about their friends and foes, treating everyone as food for their malice. This is why it's so dangerous that Geiserik didn't just bust it out on the world stage, he conquered the damn thing with it. We've seen Guts use the armor barely a dozen times, and already he's losing sight, sensation, body control, you name it. Every time the owner of the Berserker armor fully aligns with the ode inside it, they lose a piece of themselves, and they keep losing it until they have nothing left to give. If Guts has been affected this badly by the armor in less than a year of owning it, then we can only imagine the effects it would have had on Geiserik. But somehow he was able to conquer and then rule over all of humanity for a considerable amount of time, despite always being at the risk of a mental breakdown. One of the reasons for this, we think, is the fact that his lover was his anchor being, because that would explain his superior control over the armor. In chapter 361, Guts meets the creator of the Berserker armor and thanks him for his creation, which had allowed him to escape death on numerous occasions. But Hanar pointed out that though Guts had used the armor extensively, that wasn't the same as mastering it, and deep down, the Black Swordsman knew he was right. Guts could call upon the Berserker's power in tiny doses when he was doing just regular life stuff, but in times of peril, he'd find it ridiculously difficult to resist its ode, given his own inner darkness. The only way he can make it work without losing himself is if he enters the armor with Shirke attached to him, because that way she acts as an anchor for his psyche. Guts cannot control his rage and malice to the point that he can draw out the Berserker's power without losing himself, but it looks like Skull Knight could. How else can you explain his rule over humanity? Because left to his own devices, he might have succumbed to the armor the second time he ever wore it, but he had a companion whose magic was far more powerful and experienced than Shirkei's, and that was the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms. If you guys take a close look at the blood memory Guts lives through in chapter 362, you'll notice that while his armor's helmet is completely closed, Skull Knight's helmet in the vision still left his eyes open. It's rather odd that, especially considering he was watching his life's work being overrun by demons and the woman that he loved dying in his arms. The only time Guts' eyes become visible through his helmet is when he's synced up with Shirkei, and the two of them are working to keep him from going full berserk at all times. This can mean only one thing. Geiserik had far greater mastery over the Berserker armor. We're not sure what kind of life he led before pursuing his goal to rule the world. Maybe his life was as terrible as Guts, but he didn't have to suffer through the pain of surviving an eclipse. The fact that the blood memory cuts off shortly after Geiserik sees his lover pass away means that he too followed her soon after, which checks out because he's supposed to have died in that armor. But the fact that he held off on going full berserk, even in a situation like that, shows you that he was in much better control of the armor, and that explains a lot about his reign, actually. One of Geiserik's nicknames was the King of Galloping Death, and for some reason, we find it hard to believe that a full-tilt berserker would be willing to ride a horse. He'd much rather break his own bones trying to propel himself into his targets, but Geiserik fought on horseback by all accounts. This is a sign that though he was a ruthless fighter, he was no less in control of his actions than a regular person. We've all witnessed the power of a berserker in control. Guts once held up a falling mast from a Kushan galley that would have crushed his friends to death. His only complaint? His muscles would ache the next morning. A berserker in control is a marvel of death and destruction, but there's nothing wanton about it. Everything is controlled and precise, which perhaps made Geiserik that much more dangerous. He could perform inhuman feats despite being a human, and no matter what army or monster his masters threw at him, he always emerged victorious. To obtain a legacy like his, Geiserik had to have spent several years conquering and then ruling the planet, which means he got quite a bit of use out of the armor. Now, it is possible that unlike Guts, he didn't always wear it, seeing as the world was pretty much his oyster. Geiserik didn't have to worry about random dead spirits and possessed animals attacking him every single night, and maybe his moderation with respect to the usage of the armor prolonged the amount of time before he started to feel its effects. But it's clear that he did feel them because, while it gives one power beyond imagination, the Berserker also takes away pieces of their soul. Every time Geiserik fought as the Berserker, he lost a part of his senses, and his inner malice festered within his mind. His beast of darkness took the shape of a skull, probably because he knew that in pursuing his ambition, he'd become the Reaper himself. Geiserik would have had to put millions to death to secure his throne, and that kind of conquest just doesn't happen with a goody-two-shoes conqueror. You need to make hard choices and necessary sacrifices to take over the world, and with each hard choice Geiserik made, his beast of darkness grew stronger. Eventually, it grew strong enough to make him choose a life of debauchery, which culminated in his downfall and demise, but overall, he managed to get far more use out of the thing than we could have imagined. Geiserik could have owned the armor for up to a decade, if not longer. He fought alongside several allies on the battlefield, and not once did he turn on them. He kept his lid for so long that eventually the pressure just built and built and built until it exploded during the first eclipse. In chapter 290, the Beast of Darkness gave a rather ominous monologue to a passed out Guts. It told him that though Shirkei thought she'd tamed it, she'd only dulled its influence temporarily. He would recede within the depths of Guts' psyche, but only because he knew that one day Guts would break, and they'd be free to pursue their true goal with hatred and wild joy. The Beast claimed that the moment Guts put on the Berserker armor, he put it out of his reach, and that his new friend's demise was only a matter of when, not if. When that happened, he would break, and the Beast would be waiting. We imagine Skull Knight had similar conversations with his own inner beast, but unlike Guts, he was able to manage for years. He also had the advantage of having the most powerful sorceress in the world by his side, so when you boil it down to the basics, what we're trying to say here is that Skull Knight's mastery and usage of the Berserker armor was as good as it could get. He succumbed to its negative effects like every user of the damn thing, but it took him a while to get there, and in that time, he united all of humanity under his banner. Not bad for a guy that's now spending his days as a wandering spirit of vengeance, but, you know, we don't always get what we want. We're pretty sure Skull Knight would have loved to have grown old with his lover and died with her of natural causes, but that just wasn't in the cards for him. The Berserker armor devoured him, like it threatens to devour Guts, and all his restraint ended up becoming the eventual cause of the first eclipse. Now, we know securing a global empire is no joke, but the fact of the matter is that on an individual level, Guts might be a more natural fit for the armor. This isn't just because he's burning with darkness Geiserik only discovered after becoming Skull Knight, it's also because Guts is armed to the friggin' teeth. He's still not used to it, but has stockpiled it better than a barracks. Guts' usage of the Berserker armor. Guts has struggled with keeping the Berserker armor under his control for sure. He's lost himself in its violent ode at least 3 to 4 times, and on one of those occasions, he nearly killed his friends. He has a natural propensity for malicious acts, and that makes him much more susceptible to the armor's influence, but on the flip side, it makes him that much more explosive. Geiserk used an army and the controlled power of the Berserker armor to establish his empire, but Guts had no such luxuries at his disposal when he first got the thing. In fact, he was at death's door and he would have probably crossed over into the Vortex of Souls had Shirkei not pulled him out of his fight with Grunbeld and given him the Berserker armor. Now, we all know that apart from the armor, the only weapons Skull Knight would have probably used were his sword and shield, and maybe a war lance or another type of polearm when conducting cavalry charges. Guts is a walking armada, and that makes his use of the Berserker armor much more versatile, and by extension more deadly. Let's start with his sword that doubles as a shield. Dragonslayer is well over 6 feet of weapons-grade iron forged into a thick, massive slab that's durable enough to survive direct hits from Grunbeld's warhammer. It's a cumbersome thing to wield, and Guts can only do it because he's been conditioning himself to do it since before he knew he'd be wielding it. He usually uses both of his hands to swing Dragonslayer around because even he isn't strong enough to wield it with one arm at all times. But when he becomes the Berserker, he can pretty much use the Dragonslayer like a bastard sword. Yes, he still grips it with both hands, but that's to maximize his killing blow's impact. With his physical inhibitions dulled, Guts could use the blade in a formal duel like a formal duelist if he so pleased, though we wouldn't recommend he do that on account of his opponent's health, safety, and survival. Perhaps debuting the armor against Grunbeld was Miura's way of telling us that though the armor connects him to Skull Knight, Guts' war will be a lot different than his was because they live in 2 entirely different worlds. Skull Knight became a creature of darkness after his final moments had faded from time. He targeted the God Hand because in a way he helped create them, and his final moments were all about reaping the seeds he'd sown. But with Guts, it's different because he survived his eclipse and went on to become something of a monster himself as he hunted down inhuman apostles. For over 2 years, he'd spent every night fending off damned spirits. He'd be shooting and swinging his blade too often for sleep, and only through his acquaintance with Puck did he finally find some peace. His goal wasn't to establish and then rule over all of mankind, he wanted to exterminate all demonkind. And he'd have preferred to start with the head, but alas, such is the hand that fate drew for him. This extreme rage that he harbors towards the apostles for killing his first ever set of friends, and against the God Hand for what they did to Casca, is a flame that Guts will never put out, because he knows he needs it to keep chasing Griffith. Because his goals aren't spread over several years, he tends to use the armor at full capacity a lot more than he should. Between the armor and Dragonslayer, when Guts goes berserk, he becomes the best warrior on any battlefield, but those aren't his only weapons. During his second bout with Grunbeld, Guts shocks the Flame Dragon Knight not only by pushing his ridiculous frame back with a vault, but by also destroying his shield, which could apparently withstand cannon fire. Well, that might have been true for a volley shot towards him, but nothing could protect him from a cannonball being sent down the barrel of his own hidden explosive device, and that's exactly what Berserker Guts does. His armor cloaks the fact that he's got a metal arm with an inbuilt cannon, so when he shoves it down Grunbeld's shield and blows it to smithereens, the Apostle can only stand there in shock and wonder. Shock because he didn't anticipate such a risky move from a guy who could barely defend himself a few moments ago, and wonder because it proved that all the rumors about him were true. The Black Swordsman was indeed a worthy opponent for the Flame Dragon Knight, and proclaiming that, Grunbeld took on his released form. Despite having his arm and leg broken by one thrust from his dragon tail, Guts leapt at Grunbeld's face with his good hand and managed to crack his corundum skin with a Dragonslayer stab. He couldn't press the fight any further because he needed to escape the area with his friends, but we're pretty sure that if he did, he'd have A, defeated Grunbeld, and B, died doing so. Guts was already losing blood at an alarming rate before he'd put Grunbeld on the back foot, and his recovery from that fight was next to a miracle. The Berserker armor had clawed into his flesh to rearrange his bones, and several days had passed by the time the companions could pry it off of him. Even then, his wounds kept reopening, and he kept passing in and out of consciousness, experiencing all of the pain in one go. It's an agony beyond our imagination because he felt the impact of being mauled several times and having a dozen bones broken at the same time. He lost considerable weight during his recovery period, and he vowed to himself that he wouldn't lose control like that again. But he did, the very next time he fought with the armor, and then he did it twice more. His efficiency at killing with the armor outreaches Skull Knight simply because he has a lot more tools at his disposal. If the armor was able to make his arm cannon work, it should also be able to make his rapid-fire crossbow work from a technical standpoint. Combine that with the fact that he always carries throwing knives and mini bombs on his person, and you're looking at one heavily stockpiled Berserker warrior. If Guts had access to his full inventory when he loses control, no forces in the universe would be able to stop him. Shirke likes to think that she's got him under control, but she doesn't know that twice she was assisted by the Moonlight Boy in that endeavor. The Moonlight Boy possesses significant magical abilities which include things like command over all familiars and influence over positive spirits. He can also use his luminous body to keep Guts' mind from acting on its worst impulses, probably because he's Guts and Casca's demon child incarnated. Now that Casca is in Falconia, the Moonlight Boy will remain there as well, and that means that if Guts goes nuts again, no one will be able to stop him. It's a sharp contrast to Geisric, who had many experienced magic users around him that could help him prolong the inevitable. Guts' best bet right now, from a magical perspective, would probably be Daiba, but we already know that he can't be trusted. A fully berserk Guts rampaging through the Kushan capital as trolls, Rakshas, and Clipoff overrun the joint, that's just not an image that puts a smile on our face. But then again, it isn't supposed to. With the restriction of needing to impose his will on others, Guts is more liberated than Geisric, which means he's also more likely to give in to his Beast of Darkness rather than keep it chained. We've already seen the Beast escape his clutches in chapter 373. Should he lose his last shred of morality, Guts would become no better than the apostles he hunts, but then maybe that's the point. Zod once asked Skull Knight if he wanted Guts to follow the same path he took to hell because he knows what extended usage of that armor does to one's soul. Is Guts even aware of the price he's already paying in exchange for power, let alone the one he's yet to pay? We don't think so, but we've gone off topic a lot already. The point here was to talk about Guts' version of the Berserker armor, and in many ways, it's a rather fitting upgrade. But the title of this video asks us whose version was better, and, well, final call. Whose Berserker armor is more powerful, Guts' or Skull Knight's? It's difficult to gauge whose Berserker armor was more powerful because between Guts and Skull Knight, they're the only two people who have used it in its entire history. Skull Knight made use of it for much longer, yes, but the armor itself hasn't exactly changed. The Berserker adapts to whatever natural advantages its wearer provides it with and then goes from there. The end result is always the same. If the armor eats you alive, you become a cursed spirit. But the point of this video is effectiveness and impact, and based on those two factors, we'd say that Guts' version of the Berserker armor is more powerful. Skull Knight spent most of his time wearing the armor during important battles against humans that he probably had nothing personal against. He was out to take over the world, and in order to do that, stepping on toes was inevitable. Skull Knight practiced as much restraint as he could so as not to alienate his subjects by demonstrating his savagery, but Guts has no such obligations. As long as his companions are safe, he can let loose and really get into the killing flow if you give him a dozen trolls to warm him up. By the time he becomes possessed by the fetish, all of Guts' senses and weapons are tuned towards one thing: the merciless extermination of everything around him. In chapter 242, Guts kills a Makara by himself, and a single Makara is like a fusion between an elephant and a blue whale. Technically, the threat to his comrades ended with the death of the Makara, but Guts, possessed by the Berserker, proceeded to butcher every dispossessed crocodile in his vicinity. The way that he fought made even Isidro ill at the gills because he might have respected Guts as a swordsman, but even he couldn't deny how barbaric the armor made him. Guts killed a friggin' god with this thing, and unless Skull Knight manages to kill a polytheistic deity on his own, Guts will always have that one over him. But then again, his explosiveness is the reason he's pretty much a walking corpse by this point, and the best way to use the armor without losing himself is one that involves him relying on Shirke. Only when a Berserker is in control of their violent thoughts and emotions can they truly perform good deeds with the armor, and in that regard, Skull Knight was by far the better owner of the armor. He used it so much that it became part of the legend of his life, and he managed to walk that thin line of balance between purposeful anger and madness for most of his life. The one moment where he justifiably lost all control cost him his life. But up until that point, his life had been built by the armor. Skull Knight might not have had all the fancy weapons that Guts carries with him, but if he did, we can assure you that he'd have become Emperor much sooner. On the flip side, Guts could use a lot more temperance in his time with the armor because his raw strength exceeds Skull Knight's during his time with the armor. All Guts needs is a way to channel his thoughts and emotions without getting caught in the Berserker Ode, and then he can prove to everyone in the universe, once and for all, that the Berserker armor was made for him. It might have had a previous owner, but none can draw upon its power like the Black Swordsman can, and that's both a good and a bad thing. As for why that's the case, we suppose you'll have to wait and read like the rest of us, but should Guts achieve complete mastery over the armor, he'd be able to use it in ways that Geisric could have only imagined. He already eats monsters' faces and flesh in the Berserker state using his helmet mouth, but if that feral instinct were contained and trained, it could make his life a lot easier and Griffith's life a lot more difficult. For Guts' sake, we hope we're right about our assessment of his Berserker armor, because if we're wrong, then what hope can we have for the future of Berserk? And if that isn't a massive bummer, we don't know what is. Marvelous verdict! But what we do know is that it's time for this video to come to an end, because that's all we got for you on the topic of whose Berserker armor was better and why. We think overall Guts takes the prize, but to each their own. Let us know whose armor you think is more powerful in the comments section down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't. But for now, this is Wizard Wheezy signing off. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.